Good evening, everyone. I'm Sunniva O'Flynn and I work in the Irish Film Institute, and I'm really pleased to invite you all to join us for our post-screening celebration of the work of Paddy Cahill. I know you all will have seen his three beautiful films that he made with Shane O'Toole, Tulloch on Thullas, Circle Square and Common Space. And Shane's wonderful introduction, I think, gave a great sense of context to how the films were made. We are honoured to be part of this celebration of Paddy's work, and we are, of course, we were and we continue to be very saddened by his loss. He was one of our greatest and kindest supporters, particularly of new work. There wasn't an Irish documentary screened in the IFI that you wouldn't see Paddy attending, and always really supportive of the work, really generous in his comments, very modest and unshowy in his response to the work, which won't surprise anyone who knew him, because that's how he was. And in fact, that's, I think, a feature of his films as well. There's a simplicity to the work where he steps back and allows the subjects to speak, whether the subject is a human being or a beautiful piece of architecture. I think his gift to us all in his films is a greater understanding of the world around us, an opening of our eyes to the built environment. For many of you architects, your eyes are open anyway, but for people like me, we just see these lumps of granite that are suddenly humanized by the kind of work Paddy has done, and the celebration of the architects and the people who live in these spaces and work in these spaces. We're very pleased to collaborate again with the Irish Architecture Foundation. We've had a long-standing relationship. Normally at this time of year, we'd be tromping the streets and showing films in buildings in our Dublin Plays Itself a series, which is always a great joy, but it's a different kind of joy to be screening these films and to be understanding the work of architects and designers in a new way online. We, of course, are very grateful to the Arts Council, primary funder of both ourselves and IFI and the Irish Architecture Foundation. And, without the Arts Council, none of us would be able to open our doors. So thank you all. Thank you, our supporters. And thank you, Paddy and Paddy's family who are with us this evening. So without further ado, I'm happy now to hand over to Natalie Wadick from the Irish Architecture Foundation, and she is going to host this conversation about Paddy's films. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Sunniva, and hello to everybody. And yes, Sunniva is right, we would be tramping the streets, and Paddy would probably have been with us as well, and I do miss that very much. So on behalf of the Irish Architecture Foundation, it gives me great pleasure to chair this panel discussion, Paddy Cahill Remembered. And if I can just take a moment to acknowledge the heartfelt introduction to the films by Shane O'Toole, who I know is in the audience tonight. And it was a wonderful insight firsthand, Shane, to hear about your very special relationship with Paddy. And like Sunniva, I'd also like to welcome Paddy's family and friends and colleagues who are also in the room here this evening. We can learn a lot about Paddy through his films and the deluge of responses from people to his untimely passing. Buildings and films are both transformative, and he knew that. So tonight, we want to celebrate the work and life of Paddy, and particularly the work he made with Shane O'Toole. So I've invited three people who knew Paddy to help me do just that. The first speaker is from architectural history. It's Ellen Rowley, who is a professor in modern Irish architecture in the School of Architecture at UCD. She mostly thinks and writes about Irish architectural modernism. Ellen has curated Dublin's Tenement Museum, 14 Henrietta Street from 2016 to 2018, and a radio series on housing and home, Davis Now Lectures, RTE, from 2019 to 2020. She has collaborated many times with Paddy Cahill. Our second presenter is from both architectural and film theory, and that's Dr. Gul Kakmaz-Erk. She is a senior lecturer and program director in architecture at Queen's University Belfast. She leads Ca City, Cinema and Architecture in the City Research Group, organises Wall City's cities' film festivals and conducted urban filmmaking workshops until recently with Paddy Cahill. And finally, the third speaker is from Film Practice. Tig O'Sullivan is an artist and filmmaker. He works primarily in documentary film, but has made work for radio and for gallery installation also. His films often draw on archive and on literary sources. His third feature, To the Moon, premiered in Venice in September 2020. Tig is a film artist in residence in UCC Cork. So welcome panelists, good to see you. I asked Ellen Gull Tig to speak about three things in no particular order. And one was to tell us about their relationship with Paddy. The other was to comment on the three films that you've just seen here this evening. That's Tulloch and Solis, Circle Square and Commonplace. And the third, if we have time, is to speak a bit about the symbiotic relationship between architecture and film. And we can also pick that up in the discussion later. Each of these presenters will present for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. If you'd like to submit questions or even comments, please do so throughout these presentations. And I promise I will pick up some of those comments or questions before the end. So we've got about 30 minutes. So I'm going to go straight to you, Ellen, and I'm asking you just to do something a bit important first, and that is because I know that there are lots of people in this audience who know Paddy, know of him, are friends of him, his family love him, or know his reputation, but some may not know him. So as a start, can you situate him professionally for us?
Okay, thanks a lot, Natalie. I suppose I want to say, and firstly, acknowledge that this is raw, and that we only recently cycled Paddy to Glasnevin Cemetery, and that act or final cycle completely reflected the Paddy that I knew, Paddy's work and Paddy as a person. And we cycled through Dublin's north inner city streets behind Conor, his brother, and behind Paddy's coffin, and it was remarkable. And it was beautifully paced and poignant, and it was collective, though somehow private, and it was fun. And it was also a little bit anarchic, though when I say that, we had a Garda escort, so there wasn't much anarchy really, but it was typical of Paddy, you know. And anyway, you know, well, we're not here to talk about Paddy's last cycle, but I suppose I wanted to bring it up, and I wanted to say that I, for one, feel able to speak this evening despite that rawness, because of the example of Paddy's family, his sister Pamela and his brother Conor, his parents and his partner and widow Ionia. They've paved the way really for us all to be positive, and in their example to celebrate Paddy as an individual, but also to acknowledge his legacy in Irish documentary making, and to consider the importance of his work. So for myself, I am taking a Paddy Cahill style gulp of pragmatism and getting on with the business at hand. And in this case, as Natalie and Suneva and Shane have said, we're considering these really gentle but powerful architectural stories this evening. Secondly, I wanted to immediately kind of recognise the partnerships that Paddy developed, and for this evening, we're experiencing that really rich collaboration between Paddy and Shane O'Toole. And Shane has described that harmonious, maybe even symbiotic process that they engaged in. And maybe, Natalie, we'll come back to that in the panel discussion in terms of my interest in storytelling as architectural history. Yeah. But that collaborative process is Paddy all over. Indeed, it's filmmaking, as Tig will talk all over, but particularly Paddy. It's about this or maybe transdisciplinarity. It's about how Paddy inserted himself into and within different disciplines so as to fully understand the content that he was trying to capture. And yet he managed to maintain this really respectful distance, or maybe deference at all times. So, like, for me, it's really interesting, and like, it's obviously very obvious that tonight's event is jointly hosted by the IFI and the Irish Architecture Foundation, two organisations in which Paddy was a valued member, but also an active participant, despite the kind of the cultural, the different remits of these two cultural institutions. I was always struck by his pimpernel, or chameleon qualities. And by pimping, I don't mean he was sneaky, but more like shape-shifting tendencies. In any one week, Paddy might be scouting locations for hands-on RTE series for deaf viewers.
It's 7 o'clock.
And in the same week, he'd be volunteering and minute taking for the Dublin cycling campaign, or recording the assessment process for the Architectural Association of Ireland. So these communities, the architectural community, the deaf community, cycling activists, were probably the three most dominant communities in terms of Paddy's day-to-day and filmic output. But he worked for lots more. With myself and others, we worked in terms of heritage projects, conservation projects, oral history projects. Really, there are too many to get into here, but what emerges from these observations are two big issues. Firstly, that Paddy was, could be, and often was, a one-man film crew. Maybe because he came to film when he was ready. So he hadn't an ego, really, but he had plenty of determination. And so he was quite happy to be a cameraman or a locations manager and director, producer, editor, whatever, such that those of us who come from outside of film, who might need some recording or some element of film, however lowly, could approach Paddy. And if he was available, he would attend to that need. And I think another element that emerges from this chameleon shape-shifting tendency in Paddy is I suppose an openness to follow projects, to allow projects lead on one to another, or rather to allow projects develop and maybe transform along the way. I'd often thought, and in my observing of him and working with him, that he was the most independent and free of practitioners. For instance, his more kind of bread and butter work with hands-on brought him to the artist and established sign language interpreter Amanda Coogan, which then led to Amanda and Paddy making pretty spectacular durational art films, such as 13 Women in 2013 and Long Now in 2017. And in a similar way, before I hand over to Gull, what we're looking at this evening is that kind of similar relationship with Shane O'Toole and Paddy, which ultimately led to this series of filmic architectural biographies. And I think the outstanding aspect of these films is, in echo of what Suneva says, that these architectural situations are ultimately human situations. And so building by building or architect by architect, both Paddy and Shane were interested in revealing and telling stories quite simply or quite complexly. So they'd be my opening comments, Natalie.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much. Gull, over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Alan. I am here as an architect who worked with Paddy, but I could be replaced with many other architects from Dublin, from all over the world, because Paddy has worked with many, many architects throughout his life. I was on the Belfast-Dublin train over the weekend, and I was reading through the Totally Dublin, and then I came across an interview with Gillian Mars, where she mentioned Paddy's short film about Sean Hillen. She saw that, and then she decided later to make a full-length documentary about this artist. My point is, Paddy's name comes up often. If you get to know him, it comes up in architectural circles. It comes up with film directors. When there is an art event, you may come up with someone who knows him. Our roads crossed a lot in the last 10 years. So I met him first when I was doing an urban filmmaking workshop at UCD in 2010. Paddy was one of the participants, and he was already an established filmmaker. He had made his famous Liberty Hall by then. But as a humble person, he just was there as a participant. Obviously, with his expertise, he helped everyone, and personality. He helped everyone with the editing aspect of their short films, because these participants are, they don't necessarily have a film background. They're architects, artists, or anyone from the public. He helped people with sound, different aspects of software problems. Since that day on, we became collaborators in the workshops I organized. We did a notable one in Belfast here, in Place and I, in 2015, which was a really successful one. And the last one we did was actually 2020, just before the pandemic, or which was cut off with the pandemic in Berlin. We had one, we were invited to India actually right after. So after March 20, we would go in May to India to do a workshop there, which was postponed for the obvious reasons. And because of the pandemic and our really international participants, most of them couldn't make it to Berlin at the time. We were planning to find a new way to do our workshops online. So that was our next project. Actually, when I was taking notes for this talk, I do a lot of to-do lists. And one was, which I couldn't cross over, was online workshop - Paddy. That one I will never probably be able to cross. That shows the gap Paddy has left by leaving us so early. We have a saying in Turkish, which is her temas iz bırakır. That means every contact, every touch leaves a trace. Paddy touched me and many other people at so many occasions that his trace will be remembered and lived by after today. The workshops we did, they're urban filmmaking workshops. So you learn how to make a film, and the film is about the city you're in. Let's say we're in Dublin and we're filming Dublin. That means we constantly talk about Dublin from Monday to Friday while people are making their films in pairs. That really was the overlap of our interest. We are both interested in CA City, which would be cinema and architecture in the city. So the overlap of all this, obviously also art. And we were bringing our own expertise into these discussions. Workshops were not our only collaboration. We did other stuff. And like Shane said in his talk, we had a complementary partnership. We never ever had an issue working together. It was actually a joy to work together, at least on my side. And he did stuff that was needed to be done from the film perspective, and I did the architectural part. We also recommended each other for other things, I guess. He was the one who introduced me to Docomomo Ireland, and we both became committee members there. He was there already, obviously. He introduced me to Amanda Coogan, and I was invited to her theater work at the MAC, Metropolitan Art Center here in Belfast, where Paddy had done the multimedia for the background while during the play. Many things. He had this really nice time lapse he created for Limerick Open House. And he recommended me to give a talk on cinema and architecture there. We did one of the cycling with films together. And Alan did one too. Then I invited him to do a conference, architectural conference. The theme was architecture and transgression. To do that together, I wrote a piece about urban cycling. We're both passionate cyclers. And then we showed Alan's film, Cycling with Alan film there, because my film is just bubbling about cinema and architecture. Ellen gave a fantastic Dublin tour in her film. We were trying to create some more awareness among architects about about the importance of cycling. I can say many more, but I'll stop here. Just one thing. In my humble opinion, there's two really important filmmakers who have contributed to Dublin architecture and will continue to be remembered for that. One is Lenny Abramson and the other one is Paddy Cahill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gold. Tig.
Yeah, it's. I think like Gul, really any number of film, as Gul said about architects, any number of filmmakers could have been invited on here this evening to talk about Paddy. Everybody in the film industry knew Paddy. The film industry is such that people work with each other across projects over years and develop friendships, you know, standing beside cameras and under microphones and in edit suites over time. And that was very much how I got to know Paddy, through working together on different projects over the years. And before I go into talking about the films this evening, I just want to make sure that, just to say that everybody in the film industry not only loved Paddy as a person, but had huge admiration for him as an artist. Not least because Paddy was not somebody who waited around for funding and for permission to make films. Some of his most brilliant work, like the Cycling With series, which I just think is amazing, is just something that, as I understand it, Paddy just did. And it's the kind of series that if you heard that on Norwegian television, there was a short series of people having conversations on bicycles, you go, oh, that's so great, that's so cool. But you know, we don't make things like that, but Paddy did. And I've just huge admiration for him. I hadn't seen the films that we watched tonight before I watched them to take part in this panel, and it was kind of a bittersweet thing, because normally when you're watching film, you're watching it for, you know, for its meaning, for its content, for everything else. And here I felt like I was seeing a part of Paddy that I hadn't gotten to see prior to his passing. But even if I had seen them beforehand, what really strikes me as a filmmaker about them is just how deeply and profoundly human they are. I think a lot of people who make films about architecture, and there's lots of them, there's a tendency these days to use drones and all sorts of fancy gadgets that make the camera move in certain ways, and nobody sees the world through the eyes of a drone. You know, like how you show architecture in a human way is to have the camera 5 or 6 feet off the ground, looking into people's eyes, seeing architecture the way humans see architecture. And I think this is something that really shines through in these films. This is Paddy as a person, seeing the building and seeing the people. But more importantly than that, like choosing a sort of a frame to look at a building is really important, you know, and I've made films about architecture as well. And with all 3 of these films, what Paddy is focusing more than anything else on is the spaces in between. You know, it's not about the building itself, it's about the spaces between the buildings. You know, no more, you know, in Tulloch Solis, I think we get a couple of shots of the sculptural work from outside, and the rest of the time we're in the space in between the 2 parts of the sculpture. When we go down to Dundanion to talk to Neil Haggerty about that, most of Paddy's focus is to allow Neil to talk about how he engineered a situation where people would meet, you know, where you would get 2 prams to bang up against each other so that people would be obliged to make friends with each other. And he created a courtyard where people would build snowmen and children would play and then park their cars. And that aspect of architecture, you know, it would have been very easy to make a film about that subject and to ignore all of those things. But for me, like these spaces in between, that's what I associate Paddy with. Paddy was somebody that I would always meet in these spaces in between. Like I would meet him on the footpath in Clanbrassil Street. I'd meet him in the lobby of the IFI. You know, he wasn't somebody that would be on the stage. He'd be somebody in the kind of ancillary spaces around things. And I think that when you see then that he's drawing that out through his films, it's just such a resonant and bittersweet thing. I just wrote something down here because I went back and looked at his brilliant Pigeons film from a couple of years ago as well while I was preparing for this. There's a line in there where somebody is admiring the pigeons and she says, they survive in an environment not built for them. And I can just tell by the editing that this is a line that, you know, we as filmmakers will go, I'm just going to let that line breathe because, you know, I'm not just saying that, you know, it's something that was left to resonate because again, it's kind of a Paddy idea. Paddy, you know, he looked at architecture and people. And these two things don't always combine as we would wish. The city can be quite an aggressive place, but we live in, sometimes in spite of the city, and it's that striving to live was a huge part of, I think, what Paddy was about. And like I say, they're the spaces where you would meet them. I think, when you watch, there's another film that Paddy made about Herbert Sims, the modernist architecture, and there's a voiceover written by Nell Regan, and it's quite a Joycean voiceover. It's from the position, the subjectivity of the city itself. And it's a really beautiful film where he uses time lapse to show, each frame is locked, but the time lapse allows you to show the light and the movement through and about the buildings. But it got me to thinking about Joyce. And when you read Ulysses, one of the things that strikes you is, how could Leopold Bloom know so many people in a city that he just keeps running into people who know him all day? And then you meet Paddy Cahill, and you go, yeah, that's how. That's like when you're talking to Paddy on the side of the street, and he just kind of looks away, to every second person by name, and that's kind of this Joycean sort of inhabitant of the city, an adopted city. And it was something that I was kind of jealous of, to be brutally honest. But I just want to talk for a second about film and architecture before I finish up. Like, film and architecture have a lot in common, and people often talk about that. And for me, the most obvious thing is that film and architecture are often imagined as, the work of a singular, very often male genius. And the output is the thing that you see on the screen or on the street. Whereas in reality, film and architecture are all about the collaborations and the spaces in between. Again, the people who work together in the making of, and having worked with Paddy on, say, a Pat Collins film or, other films, we're getting out, that's where life happens, and I think there's a degree to which the arts are like a great building. And we focus very often on the thing that you can see, the outcome, the shiny thing. Is it beautiful? Is it the play, the book, the whatever, the building? But in a way, it's about the spaces between, and the spaces between the art industry, or the society that surrounds the arts is as important as the outputs itself. And I think this is another key part that I would associate with Paddy, is that, life happens in the spaces, the roads around the arts, and that as important for me as the outcomes, as important as the films, the books, the plays that the arts produce, is the life that it allows for people such as myself, such as Paddy, to get to know people and to form these really human relationships. And I was just thinking about tonight, if tonight was another year, we'd all be in the IFI tonight. And we'd all be spilling out into that lovely lobby in the IFI. And that's where a lot of, the proper, the real aspect of this get together would happen, is in the lobby. And I kind of have the sense that I would probably look over and I'd expect to see Paddy in the lobby chatting to 5 different people. And I really wish that was the case. So it's been a real privilege to share some thoughts on somebody who is very special here tonight. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Tig, thank you so much. I think we'd all love to be spilling out into the IFI lobby and seeing Paddy there. We've got some comments coming in, but before I go to those, can I'd like to come back to the idea of the fringes and the spaces in between, but can I go over to Ellen actually, and just to pick up what you said at the beginning when you were saying that, and it relates to the 3 films that were just screened earlier today, but they're part of a series, and Shane, a series of vignettes or portraits, and Shane had in his introduction had mentioned the ones that preceded these 3 films as well. And I'm just, I mean, that they are important. They're an important suite of films. And I just want you to maybe tell us a bit about how important are they to architectural history, and they are a legitimate form of architectural history. I would say that you would agree with that.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. I suppose there's no two ways about it. They're really important because there's nothing else like them. There's nothing that exists like them. And it is exactly that. It's vignette rather than monograph, you know, and they really remind me of something that Shane O'Toole himself may have been involved in with another collaborator of his, John O'Regan of Gandon Editions, who had made these little books, these tiny books called Works. And then later there were profiles, and they put the lens over a particular situation or a particular person. So they are, like, I suppose there are elements to them that are really of these films by Paddy and Shane that are really, really traditional, and in a way go against what Tig is saying about that kind of, you know, it takes so many people to make a building, because what they've done here is stripped everything back and focused on one place through the eyes of one man. So it's, you know, it's very protagonist driven, the architect as hero. But that has to be done because, well, I suppose I believe that has to be done because we haven't constructed the canon yet of those buildings from the mid-century to the 1940 to say 1990. And in a way we have to construct the canon so as to dismantle it. And so I can completely defend that approach of, you know, the hero architect or the hero sculptor, because I suppose if I was looking at Dundanion, I would argue with Shane and Paddy. And I should say that whenever Paddy and I went onto site, we did argue. It was quite kind of funny, and we were friends and stuff, but we didn't have that harmony that Gull had and that Shane had. And so, like, I would say with Dundanion, I would need to see some of the women who live there and such like, and I want to know more about the builders. But what Shane and Paddy have done here to argue against that is that they've made these short, very carefully paced things, and they've stripped so much back. And say, for instance, in the Goffs film Circle Square, what they're really doing there is implicitly raising the issue of value, of use and value. So it's really exemplified in something that's so recent, it doesn't have historical significance. So the horsey crowd, as Neil Scott calls them, can come in and stick on something and completely bastardize the pure geometry of the circle and the shifted diamond kind of square on its side. And so what Neil Scott says is, quote, they respect that it works well, but they don't respect it as a piece of architecture, unquote. So what Paddy and Shane are doing there is they're highlighting it as an architectural situation, as a human and animal thing, but that there is this really important design intention. And so in order to do that, I think they have to strip everything back and let the building breathe. And the pace is so generous. All of these buildings and sites are breathing. And I suppose you've got Irene Buckley's music that is completely enhancing that as well. So yeah, I suppose that's all I should say on that.
Thanks, Ellen. And do you think that because of these films that people will appreciate the architecture that's been described in the subject matter? Like, in terms of I'm trying to think of the impact and the engagement and the public engagement of these films.
Yes, well, I suppose the point is with this generation of buildings, there's lots of them, so we're really familiar with them, but they're completely unloved precisely because of the lack of distance and a whole host of other reasons around how they behave thermally and such. So what we're trying to do, Paddy and Shane and I and others, is to shift public perception. And how you shift public perception ultimately is shifting value. It's increasing engagement. And so if you increase engagement, and I suppose you defamiliarize the familiar, like the Herbert Sims flats, for instance, that Tig mentioned that Paddy and I were working on. What you're doing is you're pointing out key features, and it's like, oh, I never would have noticed that. And then ultimately you're trying to push officials to protect these things. So that is, you know, you can't construct history until you rationalize and intellectualize, and then you shift public perception towards a different value.
I think, Tig, you want to come in there. Sorry,
Yeah,
Gull, I'll come back to you, Gull, in a minute.
Just really briefly, like just to your question as to whether the films work in terms of changing perception, 100% yes. In my case, I filmed in Goffs 5 or 6 years ago for something else entirely. I missed entirely the nature of the building. I missed so much. I was watching the film going, oh my God, there's so much that I missed. But to Ellen's point about the leading with the architects and the artists, and not maybe with the women who live in Dunvannion and things like that, I think film is quite a conventional medium. And I think by setting something up as being the work of an architect, that allows a film to it's very hard to sell a non-narrative film or a film about space or things like that. If you can frame something as a biography first, then it will reach an audience quicker. But I think in the space of the 8 to 12 minutes that these films have, Paddy and Shane both set that up and then deconstruct it, so that you start out thinking you're watching a film about Neil Hegarty. You end up understanding that it's a film about life and the spaces in between. And to actually pull that off in an arc of 8 minutes is kind of genius. You know what I mean? It sets it up as a Trojan horse and then, rushes out of that and sacks the city. And I think it's really smart filmmaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Go. You'd like to come in there?
I can answer the question, but also
I was going to ask you that. But if you can answer the question and talk a bit about the films as well. It's a great question, actually. Will I read it out? Will I read it out?
Sorry, about the films first. I agree. It's an interesting. Yes, they are conventional films, and Paddy is using quite conventional techniques, camera angles, fixed camera. The architect is sitting and talking, nothing too techy. But then you get really curious, and you wish to visit the building, be there. On the one hand, on the other, when the film finishes, because you have seen so many different aspects of the building or complex and heard about it through its creator, you feel like you had been on a tour with the architect of the building or the artist of the piece. So I personally left with interesting fixed feelings. I think all films were made quite cleverly. I felt like, and I may be wrong, probably Shane can answer this, Talika Telish was Paddy's favorite out of the three. This can be wrong, but that was my feeling. Their art, architecture, and filmmaking come together, and that's quite rare. All of Paddy's interest, that there was so much joy in his frames there. One thing I really like about his framing is that when he wants to show something, he doesn't really zoom there or show the detail and put it just in front of us very clearly. His camera is a bit more distant, just like him being in the background, when you work with him all the time. The camera is there for long enough for you to see. Let's say it's the light or the weathering of the concrete. He stays there and you see it or you miss it. It depends, but that's okay. He gives the audience the pleasure to enjoy it the way they want to enjoy. The question I see here says, what aspect of urban filmmaking did Paddy engage with the most? I guess I can say, in my opinion, Paddy was a filmmaker, Paddy was an artist, but most of all, Paddy was a craftsman. Like Alan said, he would be everywhere. He would be behind the camera. He would edit the film. He would deal with the sound, depending on the project, obviously. So he was quite hands-on, and he always, to my experience at least, wanted to be in the background and take care of things. He also was quite precise about technique. So in the workshops we did, obviously the film, he's not making the film, he's helping others to make films. I think his focus in these city explorations was to try to help people to find their own voice while making those films. finding new ways of seeing the city is an interest of both of us. And then I think both of us were trying to help people to look at the same city, Dublin, Berlin, Belfast, wherever, Mumbai, and then find the things that are important for them within that city. That's what he was trying to accommodate with possibly quite precise sound, precise framing, precise understanding of the possibilities of the film medium.
Great, thank you. And actually just a comment from me, I suppose. I mean, these films are so poignant for me in the fact that I suppose it's something that's within sort of the work in the Irish Architecture Foundation, where we really do want to connect our public with architecture, but also with architects. And I think that both Paddy and Shane, who remain behind, like, you know, Paddy's behind the camera and you know Shane is asking the question. You know what you see Paddy is set up, and you know what the person, the subject, says is in response to Shane. So when I was watching them again, I was just thinking of Paddy and Shane all the time. But what they've done is that they've let the architect and Michael Warren, artist, tell the story of the building of that particular space, warts and all. And it really exposes to the general public that architecture is a really complicated, emotional, messy, but creative business, and often humorous. I love the way Shane was talking about, you see them smile, and this ease and this humanity and all of these things, and that you've all mentioned those words many times this evening, which is unbelievably really, really special about that relationship. We're going to have to finish up, but I just want to see if there is another one question from the, excuse me, I need to find my glasses, from the audience. It's just a comment from Cleena. I attended the CA City Film Urban Filmmaking Workshop in Belfast run by Go and Paddy. He'd appear on his bike and quietly point out how to look in an entirely new way. Unforgettable experience. What a brilliant comment to end our panel discussion. We're going to have to leave it there, guys. I know that we could continue talking, and maybe we will, and we'd be going to the bar for a pint now, and we should do that when we can all meet up again. And but I really want to thank you. Can I just, a message from Suneva is to remind viewers that the films will be available until the 30th of June in IFI Home. And I just want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the audience, and for the panelists, particularly for sharing their moving and personal poignant accounts of Paddy. And it was clear from each of you that in his life, when you encountered him, and in his passing now, as you reflect on him, that you were thinking again about architecture and the edges, the beautiful edges. And I never got back to talking, Tig, about the edges, the space that Paddy inhabited, where Paddy was alive. And thank you, Shane, O'Toole, and Paddy, for bestowing the honour of these screenings to the IF. I'm delighted that we got to do them. I'd like to thank Slieve O'Flynn and the team at the IFI for partnering with us on this evening and joining with us to celebrate the work of Paddy. As Shane said, your home is Paddy's natural home. And thank you to my team in the IF, especially Blahi, Anna-Marie and Alba. And I want to let you know that this event is also part of the IF Summer School on Architecture and Media, and we have a full programme that runs until the end of June, and you can find details on our website. And finally, thank you so much to Yania, Tony, Katrina, Connor and Pamela for kindly sharing these films with us this evening. You know, as his family and loved ones, we, the film and architecture community, owe a great debt and gratitude to Paddy for his art and his impact, which will endure. He was one in a million. May he rest in peace.